The ancient Roman god Janus has two faces. My book, Hyper-Christianity, due to be published on Amazon October 2022, looks at the two faces of contemporary Christianity and the problem it has. What is the problem? What do I mean by hyper-Christianity? Well, apart from the confusion it generates, hyper-Christianity is part of the general weakness typified by the religion in contemporary times. And by contemporary times, I'm really referring to post-Enlightenment, but in particular the current period. I would argue that the church hasn't been this weak since pre-Reformation times, but that's only my opinion. Let's look at a definition of hyper. When you add the prefix hyper to a word, it indicates an excess or overabundance of some kind. For example, the word hyperactive means extraordinarily active, as in, the student was so hyperactive she couldn't sit still in class. Similarly, hyperbole, derived from the Greek word for throwing beyond, means an intentional and obvious exaggeration. An example of hyperbole is the sentence, "It took forever for the taxi to arrive." This is clearly an exaggeration, as forever is an extreme amount of time to wait for a taxi. You get the point. So what we're going to look at now are a number of examples. Inductively, we're going to try and draw a pattern out of the examples of hyper-Christianity. At this point, all I've done is I've explained the prefix. But let's look at these examples. Cryptic conversations I've had with Christians over the years have included the following interactions. Firstly, me. Some historians clearly suggest some societies are more advanced than others. My interlocutor. No, it's dangerous to believe that. It's not a Christian view at all. Me. What about certain cultures that are predisposed to lying or to violence more often than others? Interlocutor. No, we're all the same. We're all sinners. There is no superior, there is no inferior. Me. What do you believe are the worst sins? Worse than, say, blasphemy? Interlocutor. Racism. Shouldn't forgiving an offender be based on his/her realization that they are wrong and therefore request for forgiveness? Interlocutor. No, forgiveness is always unconditional. They can hurt you, they can steal from you, kill your wife or children. You must love them and forgive them in return. That's what Jesus would have done. Don't you know about the lady whose sons were killed by ISIS and she invited the murderers to tea? Me. What about Jesus upending the tables at the temple and whipping the traders with a whip? Or pronouncing 7 woes for the Pharisees, calling them whitewashed tombs, empty graves, or calling Herod a fox? Interlocutor. No, Jesus was a gentleman. Always. I'm sure you can see with my interlocutor's answers, there's a semblance of truth there that sounds noble, that sounds acceptable. But for me, those answers represent symptoms of what I call hyper-Christianity. There are a number of texts I considered, major texts and minor texts I considered in completing this work. The first major text is, and everyone would agree, the best book on the secular age, post-Enlightenment secularism, or what I prefer to call secular humanism. Charles Taylor, the Canadian Catholic philosopher, wrote a seminal work after he wrote Sources of the Self, which I've also read. James K.A. Smith, How Not to Be Secular, a cheeky riposte in his commentary on Charles Taylor's Secular Age. Alan Noble's Disruptive Witness, Speaking Truth in a Distracted Age, very important work. Then the somewhat dated but still very relevant Closing of the American Mind by Alan Bloom, written toward the end of the last century, lamenting the decay of academic rigor amongst so-called institutions of higher learning in the USA. Douglas Murray's superb expose of woke culture in The Madness of Crowds. Voddie Baucham's treatment of social justice from an evangelical point of view, the catastrophe that looms. And then all of these would have been nothing if not for the great work, Tom Holland's Dominion, a study of the crucifixion and Christianity's effects on Western culture. The minor texts would include books like How Then Should We Live by Francis Schaeffer, also somewhat dated, but still very prescient, very relevant today. Douglas Kennedy's scathing expose of Bible Belt USA. Evan Davis's exposure of the marketing and playing around with truth in our modern age, and the very revealing deconversion story of Frankie Schaeffer, Crazy for God. But let's get back to this notion of secular humanism. The secular age includes what Taylor refers to as three critical concepts that have a bearing on my argument: disenchantment, haunted immanence, and Buffett self. Let's go through each in turn. And it must be said that I treat secular humanism as a competitive religion, competitive, that is, with Christianity. Disenchantment, characterized by a sense of disenchantment, Weber seems to have meant that without God or religion, modern man moves in a rational, scientific world without appeal to the supernatural and salvific, and is perhaps condemned to search fruitlessly for a meaning that was once vouchsafed to religious believers. So that's the first characteristic of the secular age. Secondly, there is what Taylor calls a haunted immanence in the secular age. The sense can easily arise that we are missing something, cut off from something, that we are living behind a screen, thinking much more of a wide sense of malaise in the disenchanted world, a sense of it as flat, empty, a multiform search for something within or beyond it which could compensate for the meaning lost with transcendence. And then thirdly, the Buffett self, a humanism accepting no final goals beyond human flourishing, nor any allegiance to anything else beyond this flourishing. Of no previous society was this true. And one is reminded of the philosopher Barnes when he said, "I don't believe in God, but I sure do miss him." But now I advance the argument even further, having looked at secular humanism, having looked at examples of where the church has really suffered as a result. I now look at this tortuous relationship between secular humanism and Christianity. I argue that post-Enlightenment secularism and post-Enlightenment Christianity have this tortuous relationship, and I call it the bully relationship, much like its cousins, the Stockholm Syndrome, indenture, slavery. It isn't harmonious. There are three moves that I identify in this relationship. They are as follows. Firstly, the classical liberalism, secular humanism complex derives its moral capital from the Christian consensus. And this, of course, is derived straight from Tom Holland's book. He proves that beyond any reasonable doubt. The second move is sinister, though. there is a cynical twist in that the liberalism, secular humanism complex extends its influence. It usurps the moral high ground created by Christianity, and not only does it claim the high ground as its own, but it then turns on Christianity and blames Christianity for many of society's ills. One can think of the prodigal son before he returned to his father, thinking of his father as the source of all his difficulties, even though he had stolen from his father. And then the third move is even more worrying, and it is really the church to blame. The weakened church now apes the distorted moral capital. It doesn't go back to the original moral capital. It distorts the secular humanist moral capital and turns on itself. That's where the hyper-Christianity creeps in. And the earlier quotes do prove that. So, in conclusion, the bully relationship, I will call the first move the copycat, the second move the usurper, and the third move, once again, the copycat.